Hi, I'm Hildegard. Welcome to the Surface Couching Embroidery class at the University of Atlantia, session 105. Surface couching is the foundation for various other types of embroidery. In this class, we'll briefly cover the following: basic couching, which is what we'll be learning today. Other examples of couching stitches that this is a foundation for, including Bayeaux Stitch, Kloisterstitch, a little bit of Opus Anglicanum, of course, because this is my class, or Nuet, and for many of these we'll have an example of applied couching. This is something that I've done with basic couching. The image on the left is an extant piece of embroidery from, I believe it was 9th century northwestern Russia. On the right, you can see I've couched it down in gold, several strands of gold over time, and that's now the sleeve cuffs on my favorite coat. This was one of my first couching projects, so there was a lot of learning involved. There's basic couching seen on appliqué. On the left, there is a panel from the Tristan hanging, currently in the V&A. On the right is a bag front that was inspired by that dragon. And if you look at all of that gold outlining, that's just synthetic gold braid that's couched down. The original had thin strips of gilt leather couched down. I couldn't find thin enough, shiny enough leather to use, so I used that synthetic gold. Bayeaux Stitch is one that most people are familiar with. It's also referred to sometimes as laid and couched, where several threads are laid down, another thread is laid perpendicularly across them, and then couched down with a separate thread. And you can see down here in the bottom corner, the petals on that white rose are all done in Bayeaux Stitch. It's a great way to cover a lot of space very quickly. Kloisterstitch is similar to Bayeaux Stitch, however, it covers the entire background of a piece. This is a piece of the Lunenburger cloister panel. It's done in wool, and the same thread that is laid is also the one that couches down all of it. Now, most of this is done in wool on a linen background. Opus Anglicanum is something that you'll probably learn about in another one of my classes. The backgrounds in Opus Anglicanum are underside couching as opposed to surface couching. But here's an example of an extant piece and a copy of that. That's a whole nother class for you to take maybe next university. That was also 14th century. Going on to the 15th century, we see a lot of couching coming back into favor. Most of what I've seen with this is religious vestments. Here on the right, we have a piece of a chasuble, on the left. And if you look at all of those swirls and sprigs and outlines, that's all surface couching in gold. On the right are two examples of what I've done following that same method, also on red velvet, which velvet does present its own challenge when you're couching things onto it. Very important not to pull things too tight, or your threads will disappear into the pile of the velvet. Or Nuet is possibly the most, well, definitely the most complicated level of surface couching. And what I'd like for you to notice is the edges of the table and the edges of the garment. Those are all 2 lines of fine gold thread laid horizontally, couched down with colorful threads vertically. The distance between the threads is what makes the picture for these. You've got it both in the picture there and in the background. This is mostly what followed Opus Anglicanum. So there's a little bit of separation between the two. And if you look there on the right, there's a piece that I've done in Nuet. That was a first try. It's a little more complicated than I was expecting. Just 2 colors there with the gold. And you can see solid lines are with the colorful threads very close together. And the lighter part is where they're further apart. So those are the basic things you can do with surface couching. Some of the oldest pieces are from the 9th century, the Masick embroideries, among others. I don't have a good picture of those that I can put up right now that's I've got copyright clearance for. So there's not that. So 9th century on up to present, surface couching is very popular in modern gold work, which is not part of our period. Now, some of the things that we can do with surface couching in the SCA, in the upper left, you can, and I'm wearing it today, you can see I've couched gold threads along the edge of a bicocket, made designs on a darker blue bicocket that was given as a prize, made other designs on a present. I like making presents. Another gold haube hat. It's got lots of surface couching all over it. And with that one, I couched the pieces before I cut them out and sewed them together. It made it much easier. A Turkish hat band there in the center. And now if you look at that little bag that has the silver in the background and the monkey on it, all of that silver is surface couching. I couched that down with a burgundy thread to match the background and the things around it, but that's all surface couching, as is the gold medallion behind the spike on the right. And then on the lower right, the couching is the silver around the edges of that lotus. So these are couching applied in the SCA. It doesn't stop there though. You can also do surface couching on things like garb. If you look at the neckline on the dress in the upper left, that's a combination of surface couching and Bayeaux stitch in the dark blue. Just be careful of what threads you use. If it's anything you're going to be washing, stick to more cottons and synthetics. They wash better. The lower left is just one simple line of synthetic silver that's couched onto a linen hood. And there are a few pearls sewn in there. But just a very simple line of couching can go a long way to fancy things up. Now, if you want to do a lot of couching and some Bayeaux stitch, you can do a lot of heraldry that way, as the White Rose on the right-hand side. That's the badge for the White Rose Abbey, which is a Scadian household. Again, all of the gold is surface couched in pairs of 2, and then there's Bayeaux stitch in the white, the outer white petals. We'll be doing very simple piece today. That is a piece of craft felt, actually 2 pieces total, a front and a back. The first thing I want you to do is go ahead and draw an initial or a shape or whatever you want the image on that piece to be. On this one, I've put just a nice capital A for Atlantia. Imagine that. And this class, I'll just be couching a single thread. The couching thread is the thread that you actually sew back and forth through the fabric. The laid thread is often your shiny thread. I've got a shiny gold wrapped thread here, synthetic gold wrapped, a silver braid, and somewhere that has disappeared, a piece of white cotton. I've decided to go ahead and do the shiny gold one because it's shiny gold. There are multiple ways of getting your gold thread or your other thread safely through the fabric. For this one, I use a great big needle. This is a large needle with a large eye that I would normally consider way too big for this thread, but I put the thread through it just a little tiny bit. And because this acrylic craft felt is pretty stiff, I'm going to go ahead and use my awl and just make sure that there's a little hole in there to begin with. Go ahead and take your fancy thread or your whatever thicker thread you're using through the back, set your needle aside. And you don't need very much on the back, just a little bit. And I like to put it through the back first thing, because once we start couching it down, rather than knotting the back, I'll just have a few of the couching stitches holding the back down. For the couching part, I usually use a double thread, and for this I'm using regular cotton sewing thread, knotted at the end, because who wants to fight with pulling your thread through the fabric? And the hardest part is usually getting started. It's easier like when we have a nice line to follow like this. We've got our first stitch. And usually for these, I try to make them just a couple millimeters apart. Being careful to go through exactly perpendicular. And then making sure that I actually cross over that tail of the thread in the back so that it'll be held down nicely. And I usually try to go always from the same side to the other same side. Remember, this is a very foundational, basic class, good for beginning embroidery to build other things on. But it doesn't hurt if you've been embroidering for a while to go back and have a review. This is a little harder to do while I'm talking. I'm trying to keep it up here for you to see than it is just independently. Surface couching of metal threads is one of the only times that I advocate for using beeswax or thread conditioner when you're working, and I didn't do that today. And you want to use that on your couching thread. In this case, it's the red cotton thread. What that does is it protects the thread from being as abraded when it covers over the gold thread. A lot of times there's a little bit of friction as it's being drug over to close, and that'll protect it. It's more of an issue when you're using silk threads than it is with the cotton, where the silk threads tend to shred a little bit easier. Notice I'm getting ready to come up on the end of this line here. What I'll do at the very end, I'll take a couching stitch just about 2 millimeters from the end of that line. And I don't want to waste too much of the nice shiny surface thread. So I'll go ahead and I'll take my needle. I'll put it where I want the thread to end and go through, put it part way through, and then I'm going to cut the shiny thread. It's always the scary part. And I'll cut it right about this far. One of the things I want you to be very aware of, especially if you have nice embroidery scissors, when you're working with the metal threads, or even the synthetic metal, you don't want to use your very best scissors for it. You'll notice that these scissors have a red ribbon, lots of red in my life, a red ribbon on the end. That's not only so that I can find them, it's so I know that those are the ones that are okay to cut metal and synthetic threads with. So I've got that pulled through to the back. Just gonna see, I caught this one with a few couching stitches before. I'm just gonna fold that up and make sure that I've got a stitch or two holding it down. So that's the first leg of our, if you're doing something nice and swirly, like an S or a curvy M or a W, something like that, you can do it all in one smooth line. But with this A, I'm going to actually use 3 different pieces. This nice long first bar, then I'll do the curved bar, and then last the cross bar. Once we're finished with that, we'll move on to do the edges and turn it into an ornament. So again, I'm just threading the end of this through here. And if you want to learn initially, this is really easier with yarn or with pearl cotton, because I'm me and you're you, and most of you are also overachievers, I went ahead and started this class in the example with the shiny gold. And it is the more difficult thing to work with. Eventually, you'll go on to working with possibly 2 side-by-side threads, but this particular one is thick enough that one is adequate to make our image. Remember, I'm going to try to hold down my tail here with the subsequent stitches, so I have to pay really close attention to where it is. Hopefully everybody is doing okay, following along and making something beautiful. One of the things I love about this is it's a great skill building activity. It's fairly low investment, so if you mess up and have to start over, that's okay. And if you're sending out Christmas cards, birthday cards, something like that, this is something that turns out nice and flat and can go through the mail just fine. Again, the couching stitches, I'm trying to keep right now probably 3 millimeters apart. Let me see if I've got a ruler in here so I can double check myself. Yep, 2 to 3 millimeters, probably closer to 3 millimeters. The closer together they are, the more secure it is and the less likely it is to snag on anything. If you remember the blue hood with the white, or with the white pearls and the silver threads, I've had to go back and fix some of those threads because I didn't put my couching stitches close enough together and they caught on things like fingernails and the edges of whatever in my bag. You can make the background any color. It doesn't have to be red. I just happen to love red. Those of you who know me know this. And it is very festive. The gold thread shows up really well on it. You don't have to use craft felt. It's just a really convenient thing to use if you're going to hang this on a Christmas tree or along a mantle or anything like that. I don't know about you, but I always look forward to the twinkling light, shiny tinsel time of year. And last December, I made a whole bunch of these. I made one with each of our cats' initials. We have 4 cats, so that was 4 right there. Each of ours. Couple of my friends who got married last year, I sent them their new monogram done this way, so that with the year, so they could hang it on their tree. That's kind of a fun thing. And because a lot of people may not be getting out and doing a lot of shopping, etc., between now and the end of the year, between the flu season and the plague we've got going, this is a nice thing to do for your yearly ornament, or just as a nice pick-me-up for people. Let's see, we've got, do I ever double the decorative thread back on itself? I do sometimes. Often, if you look at most of the projects I've done, they are double threaded. And I debated whether to do a nice swirly M or W. Our tech guy has an M for his mundane name, a W for his Scadian name. I debated to do that. In fact, I started drawing it on the back here. When I do the nice swirly W, I just double it back so I don't ever have to cut the thread. With the A, that's a little bit harder to do. If we have a little bit of time towards the end, maybe we'll do another example where there's some doubled thread for that. On a real project, what would I mark my design with? Well, it depends what the project was going to be. And I just knotted my thread. Oh well. I'm a big fan of marking things with chalk. Chalk is really a nice thing because it disappears eventually. Some of the things in period where the stitches have worn away, we can still see black lines where the markings were. Chalk on most fabrics. On lighter fabrics, I like to use a pencil or a Pigma pen that I can cover with the stitching. The biggest challenge is the velvet that I had done, that velvet rose and that velvet spike. Those I used tissue paper and stitched through the original lines and then pulled the paper out, because velvet's really hard to mark. There are different methods of doing it, but I happened to like the tissue paper. Did that answer the question for what I would mark the design with on a real project? So I've got to a point where I've snipped my gold thread again, and I'm going to pull it back to the back. Now, if you've watched events or looked at a lot of event pictures, sometimes you'll see on heraldic clothing some fairly large swirling designs that have been done in couching. A lot of times those will be cotton or wool. As much as I like to keep things as perfectly period as possible, if it's anything that's ever going to go in the washer and or the dryer, please stick to cotton that has been pre-shrunk. Wool and silk tend not to do well. Your metal threads really, really need to stay out of the laundry. So either make it detachable or something that doesn't have to be washed. How do you pre-shrink cotton thread? The best way I found to do it is gently pull the paper or plastic parts off, like for a DMC type thing. Tie it gently with other strings, stick it in a lingerie bag, and run it through the washer and dryer. And pre-shrinking is one thing. Most of your DMC cotton is really good quality, and it does not really shrink like some of the cheaper kinds do. What this does, in addition to pre-shrinking, is it gets any initial bleed or fade out, particularly if you're doing something like red on white. Nobody wants a pink halo around their red stitching. So here's the completed initial. I need to get it over here where I can see to tie it off on the back. Okay, tied on the back. What we would do next is make a little bit of a hanging loop and sew up the edges. Two of your very best friends in any kind of embroidery, especially when you've started doing it for a while, are a pair of nice sharp scissors and needle threaders. I found these nice plastic needle threaders on Amazon. They weren't terribly much, but they last a lot longer than your regular little metal ones. I'm pretty hard on them, but definitely a good tool. Don't be too proud. Makes threading things much, much easier. While I'm working on this, one of the things that I'd like everybody to think about and be aware of, embroidery of any kind doesn't just happen overnight. It's definitely a time and effort investment. And yes, today we're just jumping in and doing a little project, but for some of your bigger projects, especially if it's a technique that's new to you, it really pays off to spend some time doing embroidery doodles. And by that I mean little skill building pieces, figuring out how the stitch looks on a fabric with a certain thread, or how long your stitches need to be, just sort of building your skill for that thing. Now I'm going to share with you one of my dirty little secrets. Don't you just love dirty little secrets? Maybe. I could just hold these together and stitch, which is what I've done before. It's not a problem. But one of the more handy things, especially if I want my little threads to possibly not come out, is glue sticks, Elmer's School glue sticks. This is basically a modern version of some of your Casein glues, and it's not going to hurt the craft felt at all. In fact, it's really good if you're making garb and you have little fiddly bits you want to stick in one place. Because what happens is the school glue washes right out of things. We're not going to wash this, but if we were sewing little bits of garb, applique onto garb or something, that glue stick is really a valuable tool in that it will hold things in place without any pins or any other issues. So I've glued that, and I'm going to press it nice and smooth. Part of this is to keep my threads from coming undone, and I need to, there we go. Threads from coming undone in the back, so that's nice. And oops, I forgot to put my hanger in. I'm going to go ahead and just knot these together at the end and stick the knot on the inside. The gold wrap threads, especially the synthetic ones, are a little bit fragile, but they're not unworkable. So that's going to be the hanger. Now, I can just whip stitch the edge together, or if I'm really feeling fancy, I can put a line of metallic along there. For now though, on this one, I'm just going to go ahead and whip stitch the edges. And if I decide to put a little bit more shiny thread later, I can always go back and add that. I like to start my initial stitch sort of going in between the two so that I can hide that little knot. And these whip stitches are probably 4-ish millimeters apart. You can do it in a matching color like this, or you can do it in a contrasting color, depending what you're after. Another really fun thing to do like this would be to do heraldry. Maybe you want to make a little present for a friend and their heraldry is not ridiculously complicated. It's a nice thing to do on one of these. At this point, I'm basically just closing up the edges. I have the hanging loop. If I want to hang it off of one of the tree branches, which I probably will. One of the things that people seem to have challenges with for some reason is turning corners with a double thread when they're couching. And if you don't mind, I will step over and grab another piece of fabric and we will just sort of cover that, which we hadn't planned to do, but we have time to do. So before I do that, questions of any kind are welcome. Well, any surface couching embroidery kind. What do I mean double thread? If you look at many of the period pieces, rather than just having a straight single thread like this, like we've done in our example, I'll flip it over so you can see. Instead of just doing one thread, they'll do two threads side by side, which gives a bolder look and can cause some challenges when people turn corners. The thread I've got right here is the shiny thread. You could do it with, here's my cotton. This is just a piece of pearl cotton. It's number 5 pearl crochet cotton. Again, single line is fairly plain. Much of what we see in period was actually a double line. So it's 2 threads, just parallel. And you couch both of those threads down with the same stitch. Let me grab another piece of fabric real quick and we'll do an example of that. Big surprise here, the handiest piece of fabric I had was another red one. This is red linen. And I'm just gonna go ahead and make a little piece of it here so I can show you without slopping this whole thing around. We'll do a basic heart shape on this one because that does us a couple of curves and a point at the end. I know there are more period shapes, fleurs and things, but since we're doing this sort of spontaneously, I'm not going to try to draw that. Here, so I've drawn that on. And for this one, we'll go ahead and use this. We'll use this piece of silver thread and we'll just double it. And again, the red cotton thread for couching. If any of you have looked at Ornoé very much, those threads always run 2 at a time, but they're very, very tiny, so it's a little bit harder to see. And if you think back to that red velvet chasuble that we looked at, those were also all double threaded as far as the gold on there. The regular thread, I always double and knot at the end just because I don't like fighting with trying not to lose it when I'm doing surface couching. You can do just a single thread. I also like the little extra added security that the doubled thread gives. And that's just for just plain couching. For Bayeaux Stitch or for Ornoé, those would be single. I put both ends of the silver thread through the giant needle, and I'm going to go ahead and take them both to the back to begin with. And we'll do that up here at the top center of that heart shape. This piece, probably because linen is a lot more flexible, it would be easier if I had put it in a hoop, but working it just in the hand is not an unreasonable thing to do. The larger things like Ornoé and that sort of thing, I work in frames. You can get really nice tension in a frame that you can't get any other way. But for most little things, they can be worked just in your hands. As much as we all miss events and miss seeing our friends, it is really nice to be able to learn things from people across the known world and visit this way too. Although I can't wait to see you all in person again. Notice I'm still using the little red thread. That's a little closer. And I'm doing it about 3, maybe 4 millimeters apart on this. And it's really important to make sure that the laid threads, in this case that's the silver ones, don't cross over each other. I did a red heraldic rose on red velvet with gold threads, and there were a couple places where I messed up and they crossed over, and to this day it bugs me. I should probably just take it apart and fix that. But there are so many other beautiful projects to do. And this, I didn't show a lot of pictures of garb, but if you look in paintings and things, you can see evidence of surface couching on clothing, especially your fancy clothing, all the way through the end of our SCA periods. I don't know that it was used on clothing as much early on. My specialty is Opus Anglicanum, which is the height of that was mid 13th to mid 14th century. So that's really where we focused. But surface couching is really easy. Compared to other embroidery forms, it's also really quick. And it's a good way to handle some of the more fragile threads without completely destroying them. Or just to make a big swirly outline of something on the side of your tunic. We all love seeing the fanciness and the pageantry of that, especially if we can see you clear across the field with it. Surface couching is great for outlines or for fill. If your banner is really, really big, I would totally recommend doing some appliqué. It takes a lot less time to fill in. My favorite side list I made many years ago, and I put giant appliqué on and then outlined it in surface couching. And to this day, I still wear it, and it's still one of my favorites. Little favors or largesse? Absolutely. As far as my favorite brand of synthetic metal thread, I honestly don't like the synthetic metal thread because it's harder to work with than real metal thread. But if you want the synthetic braid like what I started doing this heart with, the synthetic braid that is the easiest to work with and the most durable is this one. It's, I don't know if you can see that, it's Krynic, and a lot of your hand embroidery shops will carry it. This is a fine number 8 braid of Krynic metallics, Krynic metallics. Then there are ones like this that is the wrapped thread. This is also a synthetic I was using today. This is one that I get off of Etsy, a shop called Embroidery Materials. You can get fancier, more expensive ones various places, but I go through a lot of metallic threads, so I tend to go with a less expensive one unless it's a special present or something like that. Finishing an ornament piece, yes, that takes way longer than I expected it to, but it's worth every bit. A lot of what we have that's extant from any of the periods tends to be religious in nature. And so if you look around the edges of some of the chasubles and albs and things like that, you may see some. Now, 12th century, if you're thinking 12th century women's garb, what we call the bayelet often has quite a bit of decoration around that long neckline. Surface couching is very likely to have been used, but since we don't have extant examples, there's not really proof. One of the things you want to be careful with as you do surface couching is not to pull your couching stitches, that's the one I'm doing in red, too tight. If you pull it nice and smooth, you'll get a smooth line. If you pull it tight, you'll get a puckery, wavy line. And I'm pretty sure that you want a nice, pretty, smooth line. Couching is very forgiving, and if you need to pull your stitches out ever, it's a lot easier than pulling out various other kinds of embroidery stitch. So because I'm using the synthetic braid on this one, instead of making a sharp point at the bottom of the heart, oh, I missed my thread there. I went ahead and made a tiny loop. If it had been metal thread, I could have squeezed it into a point. Unfortunately, synthetic thread doesn't really do that. Once upon a time, they may still do it, DMC offered a metallic thread that was available at Joann's, etc. in a skein. If you really want to hate working with metallic thread, use that one. It's what I first started working with. It is the most difficult thread I've ever run into. This is something where the quality actually does make quite a lot of difference. The stuff from Miriam's, somebody was talking about, that's what this shiny gold that I used for the ornament is. I actually put it on a little tiny coma. I've got some on the bigger comas too, but this was a piece because it got very tangled on me. The stuff from Miriam's is synthetic, but it's also very nice synthetic. I like it a lot. Benton and Johnson metal threads are wonderful. They're also a little bit more pricey, but they are some of the best out there ever. Now, while we're talking about metal threads, because metal threads, I have cats. I love my cats. Keep the metal threads away from your cats. I'll keep all the threads, but particularly real metal threads, because cats love threads and strings. The real metal threads often are gold-plated, silver-plated on a base metal. What this does is, in addition to the issues caused by cats eating the thread and it getting tangled up in their intestine, is it gives them heavy metal poisoning, which is lethal unless you catch it in time, and then it may or may not be. When Andromeda Persephone was a kitten, she somehow found a little tiny piece of gold pearl that had escaped somewhere, and she almost died from it. She is now the most expensive kitty on the planet. So yeah, keep everything. She's not even allowed in the room where we do metal thread embroidery at all now, just for her own safety. And probably dogs would be susceptible to this. I don't know, because I've never dealt with dogs, but cats for sure, that's a potential issue. And I would be devastated if anybody's cat got hurt from metal thread. Okay, done with the Pets and Threads lecture. Thank you so very much for choosing my class. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to get a hold of me. Or if you just want to talk embroidery, not just surface couching, this was a good beginner class. But if you want to talk Opus Anglicanum or Nuet, embroidery in general, I'm your person. Have a wonderful afternoon, and if not before, I will see you next university. Maybe I'll take your class. We'll see. Little heart's almost done. I'll just plunge that thread in once I'm finished. But that's it for today. Be excellent to each other and stitch beautiful things.